This episode of Dirty Laundry was brought to you by Coercive Law.
I'm Amanda Silver.
And I'm Alex Howard.
And this is Dirty Laundry. Trish Guise is a trauma-informed forensic coercive control consultant. She works with families, victims, survivors, and professionals in detecting coercive control. So tell us what you do exactly. Your title, how you got to where you are, and what type of service you provide.
Well, I used to be what's called a divorce coach and pre-mediation coach, and I still do that. But now I've moved into the forensic side of things. So I consider myself a behavioral scientist and a researcher, but primarily looking at coercive control because that's where my education is in the psychology of coercive control. So I essentially help people identify coercive control and then more importantly, address it. So how are we addressing it through the courts? How are we addressing it through everyday life? And because we're finding that, especially in family law, it is very difficult to evidence it, it's to prove it. Part of it is an education factor with educating the decision makers, but part of it too is, since it's so insidious, how do we actually, and since everyone's so used to single incident reporting and looking at physical, how do we evidence this in a patterned way so that people will understand it? So that's where my expertise comes in, is getting people to kind of encapsulate all of it to prove to a decision maker that this is happening, so I need protection.
It's so fascinating.
It really is. And I'm so interested to hear how you do evidence that in terms of the family law world, because family law is just rife with allegations. Everyone has allegations of poor behavior and conduct, and this one's a narcissist, that one's a narcissist. But then how do you actually, paint a true picture to maybe a judge or an arbitrator?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the term narcissist, because that is a great word that people use to kind of, again, encapsulate all the behaviors. It's just a nice go-to word. But I find, the courts don't appreciate that, because then essentially we're diagnosing people. And so I use it interchangeably, but that's part of the problem, is that victims are trying to find a quick and easy way to show that this is happening. But the problem is that we're relying on victims who are traumatized and sometimes don't even know the extent to which they're abused. They could have trauma coerced attachment, what have you. Plus, they're panicking, trying to protect their children, and always thinking of, if I do X, what will the consequence be? So sometimes it's a matter of actually, how do we get the evidence down? And in other times, it's how do we have that victim present? Because everyone just seems to forget that we're talking about a human being. And I realize we should be focusing on best interest of the child. But I figure if we're focusing on the victim and we take care of them, I think they can take care of their own children. That's just my own point of view, right? I just think we're throwing, they're in this vortex of abuse. It's like being a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
And, being tortured and constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. But yet somehow they're supposed to be a fabulous parent, and they're supposed to be able to cooperate with the co-parent, and they're supposed to this and supposed to that. And then to get them to now prove it is very difficult. And then, of course, we have false allegations in response to if they do, just like in with sexual assault cases, then we have sometimes the offender retaliates with a defamation suit. So they're constantly being bombarded. And so oftentimes they just give up, because I feel like we don't have a solid, we don't have solid evidence that we know what we're doing. So if you come to us and you tell us what's going on, we'll protect you and we'll make sure that the offender is accountable. But we don't do that yet. Nobody knows how to do that yet. So I'm trying to work on that, but it's not easy.
No. And that's the thing. These victims who come out with these allegations of coercive control and of a pattern of behavior, and then as a result, act protectively of their children, get accused of being an alienator. Right? And then have other accusations thrown against them. So it's like, is it worth it for them to even speak up? Because they know they're going to be getting, mud thrown at them from the other side, accusations that they're have a different agenda. So how do you, as someone who specializes in this, in this field, help them? How do you protect them?
Well, a couple of different ways. I first give them some information that it's not great to share, not great for them to hear, but they're always looking at, how do I get them to stop? And essentially the answer is you just don't, because we don't have that much power to 100% predict what they're going to do, but we also can't control other people. I work on first with trying to control their own emotional regulation, try to get that going, perspective, but also how they respond or how they prepare. Because I find, as a victim, well, most of us, but also as a victim, you're constantly reacting because you don't know what's coming down the pipe. So I do tell them what probably to expect, because I hear a lot of people saying, okay, well, if I give them this, then maybe he'll calm down. Or, you know what, actually, he's been pretty calm right now. And I think, great. But it's usually the calm before the storm. And I tend to be, sometimes it's not fun because I have to tell them the not so nice things to expect.
Yeah, you're the bearer of bad news.
And because you know the patterns, you've studied the science behind it. You know that these are sort of cyclical patterns that these sort of abusers follow. So even though it might be calm and they don't want to rock the boat and everything's great, it's building.
It's only a matter of time.
It's only a matter of time before something else happens.
Exactly. And so that's half the battle, is knowing what to expect and not to have false hope that if I take less child support, if I do this or do that, then maybe they'll calm down. And I haven't seen it yet.
No.
I think, well, maybe this will be the first time, but I haven't seen it yet. And getting them to understand too, that it really, the issue is not the issue. So no matter what you do, he or she's going to behave in a certain manner.
Yeah. No matter what you give up, no matter how much
how you behave,
time or concessions you make in a settlement discussion, it's not going to change their behavior.
Can we just pause for a second for our listeners? Can you give a bit of a definition or descriptor about coercive control, just so that we're all on the same page?
Sure. Yeah. Coercive control essentially is pattern behavior that is intended to control someone else, to deceive, to isolate, to intimidate. And usually it's not just a portion of their life. They want to control that other individual in totality. And the three things I typically and other practitioners look at are three different questions you can look at if you're trying to determine, is this coercive control? Am I being abused? Which a lot of victims do ask me. I don't know if this is. They know something's not right. But, the first question would be, is it pattern behavior? If it's one-off, typically not. Because it is about pattern. Because when you're looking at these individual behaviors, and that's a problem we have with court, is that sometimes they seem innocuous, but as a pattern, it's a problem. Also, does it instill fear in an individual? And then the third question would be, does it make an individual change their behavior? So do they stop doing something they normally would do, or do they start doing something they normally don't do? So, because you're now controlling that person's actions. And the interesting thing about coercive control is actual overt coercive control only has to occur for a while, because then the person can be absent. So let's say after a separation, and the person continues to be controlled, even though the abuser is nowhere in the vicinity. It kind of takes them over itself and does the work for the abuser.
So they've laid that foundation, and now you're in this perpetual state. Wow.
And during the marriage, let's say, we're talking about married couples, it's present. Often that's what is part of the reason why separation, let's say, happens. And then it changes. Post-separation coercive control can look very different than married coercive control, right?
Yes and no. It can be a lot of the same, but worse.
Right.
Or it can even not occur during the marriage per se, but start afterwards. But you're right. It is different, first of all, in that people are always surprised it doesn't stop. As I think most of us know, that the most dangerous time for a woman typically is when they're leaving the relationship, because what happens is the abuser no longer can control you physically. And so they have to find other ways when they're separated. And that becomes even more dangerous and more all-encompassing, and also using the children in that regard. A lot of people, though, I find too, even during the marriage, they do use the children and use a lot of these tactics. It's just not as noticeable because you're within that family unit, and nobody else outside your relationship notices as much. When you leave the relationship, that's when you start to notice. And a lot of people will not leave right away, or it takes them a long time to leave because of what you were just mentioning, that they are aware or afraid that it will become worse once they leave. They won't be able to protect their children, because at least when they're together, they're in the home and they can monitor and try and protect them. But when you have your children with that other individual and you're no longer there, that's a scary notion. And a lot of people think it's better for me to stay.
Now, you mentioned that it doesn't often present in marriage, only upon separation.
Sorry, I meant it not often, but it can on occasion where it's not as overt
Right.
and not as noticeable. Even in my own case, I would say that looking back, yes, I see the red flags
Right.
now, as we all do.
Yeah.
But I can see why nobody, including myself at the time, did notice, because certain individuals are extremely adept at putting forth this image of, I'm an involved dad, I'm an involved husband, I'm a this, I'm a that. And then, of course, it's different behind closed doors. But when you're raising toddlers and you're doing all sorts of other things, sometimes you just chalk it up to just normal marriage strife,
Right.
Yeah.
or whatever. But what I find is that it does occur, but it's sometimes an undercurrent. And then as soon as a trigger happens, an assault happens to the offender, essentially, where they're left. That really seems to be like some people call it a narcissistic injury, but it really is that abandonment. And that's when the coercive control gets kicked up quite a bit.
Right. And is that typically when we're seeing it sort of move from just a controlling sort of power, establishment to physical abuse or anything more? Or is this sort of a niche in which they reside and stay? Like, is it a style of abuse that is
ongoing throughout the post-separation
or that
period, or
morphs into
Right.
various other styles of abuse? Or is it really sort of specific to just this kind of behavior?
Yeah, no, physical, I find, and that's the interesting thing, is that I don't focus too much on the physical, because we do have, everybody notices that.
Right.
But what we find is there was a research study based on all of the court cases in Canada in the last, I think, 3 years since the Divorce Act amendments, and looking at how is coercive control addressed. And it's interesting because each and every single case, there was coercive control, but there was also physical abuse. And so that usually is part of it, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of smart abusers don't, because you can't. No, they won't physically abuse, because you can see those bruises and you can see that tangible evidence. And that's not really what they're trying to do. They're trying to control. And it's interesting. Sometimes all it takes is a look. I'm sure maybe you've seen this in mediation, that it's just a look. It's just a tapping of the fingers. It becomes so insidious because you've already laid the groundwork before. The abuser doesn't have to do much. I mean, sometimes they go and they do overt things, such as, okay, now you don't have any access to the money, or, I'm not going to pay for any of the child's schooling or anything like that. So now that's your fault. It could be any of those things. It can be not allowing them to come back home and gather their items. It can be all those things. It's just what I find is that pre-separation, there isn't as much of an obsessiveness or a focus on it. As soon as separation hits, there's this level of obsession, and the time invested in the tactics used is really quite something. And that's something people don't really think about when they look at really how much of a problem is this behavior. You actually think about some of the time invested in sending messages, in doing the legal abuse, the financial abuse, all that. It's like a full-time job. And that's scary, because that person also knows there's consequences, but that's irrelevant. What's most important is controlling this individual, and that can be very dangerous and can lead to fatality down the road if we don't watch it.
Is this type of behavior typically found in somebody who, if given the opportunity, would be diagnosed with some kind of mental health, some kind of disorder? Like, is it characteristic to
a specific mental health disorder?
Like
who are the
because we can't
offenders
diagnose,
here?
but we've seen it
We've
all.
seen it. We, obviously, it's clear as day sometimes.
And so we can't say, oh, well, we know narcissistic behavior typically comes from like, trauma and insecurities,
personality
and all that.
disorders, or,
there's usually a root cause.
Tendencies, or like what is the root cause to the offenders doing this?
Yeah, we don't know 100%, and I caution sometimes too, because I know I've fallen victim to that too. We're always trying to find out why, right? Because then we can at least maybe understand or prevent. And but then we have sometimes people will I just don't think it's a wise idea to do that, because we're never going to get their okay to actually test them,
right?
To see if they are in fact having a mental disorder. But I think, especially when we focus on that too, sometimes that takes the accountability away, because perhaps they do, And a lot of them probably do. But, this isn't normal behavior. So
Right.
if you've had a normal upbringing, this is my own belief. If you've had a normal upbringing and nothing that traumatic or no injuries, I think it'd be hard pressed to see this kind of behavior.
Even if you didn't have a normal upbringing. I mean, lots of people have
Mhm.
childhood trauma. Lots of people have
Absolutely.
difficult upbringings, but they don't become this type
Abusers.
of person. They
Yeah.
don't become abusers,
Yeah.
right?
It's
You,
not-
at some
Exactly.
point,
Yeah.
you have to take accountability for your own behavior as an adult and not
Yeah.
blame
Right.
it maybe on, oh, well, I had a shitty childhood. So what do you expect
Right.
from me? Like, no.
Yeah, because a lot of people do. You're right. And that, those that do abuse, I'm sure do have that in the background, but those who have that background don't always abuse.
Right.
And so you're right. It is often used as an excuse or to feel sorry for them or to justify. And in fact, I firmly believe this behavior, they're compelled, they can't seem to help it, but it is a choice.
Mm.
And how I know that is because they don't do this to their boss. They
Right.
don't do this to other people
Interesting.
who actually can make decisions that will negatively affect their life. They only
Right.
do it to whom they think are vulnerable.
Right.
Who they can actually control. That's so interesting. Now, you both said the word accountability. And the reason I ask is not necessarily to let the abuser off the hook or give them an excuse, but more for the victim,
Mm.
so that they
Mhm.
know there was nothing that they could have done
Mm.
differently to spur on this type of behavior or to encourage, that reaction. So it is like the accountability piece is so crucial, but I think like where does that buck stop? Because we don't want to put any accountability on the
On
victim.
the victim.
But I know I like answers. I
And the
like
victim often
Yeah.
gets blamed.
well 100%, but I just like to be able to have maybe not a diagnosis, but some kind of logical
Like, it's not
explanation.
me, it's them.
Yeah, and maybe it's not even them. It's something more, something bigger. Like you said, they're compelled. But then when we
Yeah.
get into the minutia of, they could have done that to the soccer coach and they could
And
have
they
done that to
didn't.
their bank manager
Yeah.
and they chose not to, you can see this sort of gray area with which they do have some control over the behavior.
But do you also see that it's also a pattern where they might be doing it to other partners, maybe before
Prior
you
to.
or after you, right? Like
100%.
it's not just a one-off. If someone has a pattern of doing this is part of their MO, they're probably likely going to do it again.
Exactly. I think there's a really good point you brought up. If you're in what you think is an abusive relationship, you can go to the police service and ask them to do a check to see if this individual has committed abuse
Right.
before. I don't think a lot of people are taking advantage of it yet. I know the UK started that and the uptick isn't great. And the debate is, why is that? Is it because people are afraid or is it because the police aren't taking it as seriously? I'm not sure about the parameters because it's not just anybody can go.
Right.
So I have a feeling that they're very cautious, especially in Canada, about privacy, yada, yada, yada.
Sure.
But there also is something called the homicide timeline that, because everybody always often says, well, it's a he said, she said, or you're complicit in it somehow. What did you do to bring on this abuse? But in actuality, with the homicide timeline, which comes out of the UK, it's 8 stages. And the first stage is basically the pre-introduction stage. So most people will find, if you look back far enough, they have done some facsimile of this before. And what I mean by that is that means then it has nothing to do with the victim.
Right.
It's because they've already come this way. And to me, forget about all the education and everything else, just to me logically, there's nothing that a person can do to warrant that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
I don't care what it is, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're a child or an adult, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter to me, even if the individual can't help it and they behave that way, it still is dangerous because it often does ramp up. And with the homicide timeline, very few people get to stage 8, which is fatality.
Right.
But every time there is a case like that, we've heard lately a lot of these cases where there have been fatalities. Every single one of those cases, we look back and coercive control was a predominant feature in the relationship. Just nobody could attend to it.
So here at Dirty Laundry, we have had the pleasure of working with Michael Korstein of Korstein Law.
Some of you might recognize him from our Ask Mike segments on our Instagram and from his appearances on Global News.
In addition to being the DL's trusted in-house counsel, Mike is a former Crown attorney who specializes in both criminal and family law.
Mike is a skilled litigator with extensive trial experience. His Toronto-based law firm, Korstein Law, offers both criminal and family law services.
So head on over to korsteinlaw.ca to book your consultation today.
And so now the courts are recognizing, very recently, coercive control, right? As it might not be necessarily a criminal act, but it can be considered abuse for family law purposes. So I'm curious to know, what does that look like in terms of, like, how do you prove that to a court that this is happening?
Well, and you raise a good point again, too, that the Divorce Act amendment 3 years ago has included coercive control under the umbrella of family violence. So they need to look at that and whether or not it's present when they're making decisions about parenting time. And so it is very difficult because I find when people are telling the story, victims tend to not remember things chronologically. We tend to remember only bits and pieces. And then, of course, when we remember later, it's just like sexual assault victims. We remember later. The question is, why didn't you bring this up before? I've actually had a client who said the judge said, isn't this convenient that this came up at this point in time? Things like that. And so it's difficult to prove, and it's not, in my opinion. I mean, if we get everyone trained and everyone understands coercive control and understands that the rate of false allegations is so small, something like 3 or 5%. If we can get rid of that notion, then I'd say, okay, the issue is simply how do we bundle it to prove it properly? But that other element is such a big factor. But in family law, it's different than criminal. I'll talk about criminal in a second. We don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It's only on the balance of probabilities. Whereas in criminal, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And there is a bill going through right now, which I think is going to probably go through to criminalize coercive control. And that's a whole other ball of wax we can talk about later. But with the family law, what I always tell people is, because you want to tell the story, because the judge will know, or your arbitrator or mediator, whoever, doesn't know anything. And now you need to paint the story. So you need to do it somewhat chronologically. And what people tend to forget is they just focus on the here and now, but we need to give the history as well, too. History of who's caring for the child, the history of the financial abuse, legal abuse, because oftentimes people won't understand that if you have to account for every single dollar on your grocery bill, if you don't have any of the financials in your name, if you don't have any of the passwords, things like that, pre-separation, that is indicative of financial abuse. And that's something we need to show the judge that this has been a pattern. Or even if it just started after separation, that's fine. But what I try to do is, my favorite thing is to do a table, because, we write all these affidavits and there's just long sentences. And, I think if judges are like me, I just gloss over. Have you have financial abuse, legal abuse, whatever categories you want. And then within that, do 10 to 12 different examples of the pattern behavior in that. It's pretty hard then to look at that and think,
it's not.
I don't think anything's happening.
Yeah. So what are some early red flags? Okay, you talked about money. You talked about, things in your name. What else can folks at the beginning, if they are starting to get that, spidey sense, they've asked those 3 questions to themselves and it's kind of erring on the side of potential, like what should we be looking out for?
Do you mean pre-separation or post?
Pre, like, or even early relationship stuff. So like if you've let's just go way back. If you've just got into a relationship with somebody, it's going really well. I'm assuming there's a lot of like the love bombing and all of that in the beginning, tons of gifts and, over the top romance. And then what happens? Something changes.
Well, and even if something doesn't change, I'm glad you brought that up with the love bombing. That's so easy to fall for. Who doesn't love that kind of attention? And
we're
even
sold that. We're sold that in like Hollywood. This is what you should be looking for. You should be swept off your feet.
Yeah, your prince comes and makes you the center of his world and just gives you wants to give you the world,
so
and
we're
to
conditioned.
take care of you. And
we're conditioned to want that, and celebrate when we have that, and tell all of our friends and family, look at this, over the top romance that I've just been swept off my feet, and yada yada yada. And then the kind of other shoe does drop.
It does, because they can only do that for so long. It's really hard to keep that up. And I find that not only is the love bombing happening, but if you actually look at it logically, so there's a lot of rush to commitment. So you'll have people do, like these public engagements that are, in front of a ball game or anything like that. That always concerns me. Everybody thinks, oh, how cool. And I think, oh, first of all, I get a pit in my stomach because I'd be so uncomfortable, even if I knew it was coming.
Totally.
Right? But second of all, if you think about it, if you think about what a great way to coerce a yes, because she's not going to want to embarrass herself. She's not going to want to embarrass him. The whole world is watching. And you'll find that kind of stuff happens And if that happens, especially if you haven't even talked marriage or you weren't aware of something like, or they didn't check with your family members to see if you'd like this, that is a huge red flag, because what they're trying to do is get you to do a public commitment. So it's so much harder to retract it after, to try and amalgamate your finances quickly, to move in very quickly, also to talk marriage and babies, try and get you pregnant early. Any time there's this commitment, and that's why it's so successful, because we also taught too that men don't like to commit, which I think is a fallacy, but we're sold that. And so if somebody wants to commit that early, well, we want to jump on that bandwagon. And I think absolutely not. Also and we look at teens too, look at teen dating, that if they are jealous, they don't want you to talk to so-and-so and so-and-so. That is a huge red flag. That happens once, I say, run for the hills. Yeah. Because it doesn't just happen once. If they start talking trash about your family, things like that, because what they're trying to do is isolate you. Things like, are you going to wear that tonight? Are you sure you're going to wear that? Either it's
Doubting,
not to their liking because you're having to be their trophy, or maybe it's a little too revealing for their mind. Things like that. Anytime where they shame you, anytime you feel shame, because especially early on in a relationship, never should you feel shame, but early on, they're putting their best foot forward. So if you're feeling you have to justify anything, whether you're at work or whether you're friends or kids or whatever, I always say, don't allow the good things to overshadow that. Because to me, it only takes one of those bad things. Even if it doesn't escalate, you really shouldn't be with somebody who makes you feel small or wants you to feel invisible.
And we often talk about like in abuse situations like this, it almost is this goal to sort of get, the smartest, the most successful, the most beautiful, you said trophy wife. Is it that sense of accomplishment? Like, is this a challenge that they have to win at? Like, where does that line kind of...
Is it a sense of ownership of you? Like, I think that comes into it as well. Like, they objectify the victim, that they own them.
Yeah, I think you're both right. I never quite thought of it that way, but I think so, that it could very much be an accomplishment. And because they do, if you look at, say, especially post-separation, why victims have such difficulty is because every single one of them, all they want is peace. Can I just have some peace? Can we just move on? They don't want them to go to jail. They don't want them to pay any fines. They just want it to stop. Yeah. Whereas the abuser tends to get a high off of this. Yes. There many times they'll do it just for the sake of doing it, because you'll look at them and you think, but what you've just done is you've shot yourself in the foot. Or, I've heard people say, I've even heard it myself, where I don't care if I go broke just as long as she does, or vice versa, that kind of thing. And so you think the accomplishment factor is definitely a thing, coupled with the dopamine rush. That, I got them to do this. Also, particularly if those around you, if they can know the psychologists, the social workers, the mediators, arbitrators, which is very easy to do, not because we're all, we're not intelligent. It's because they're so good at it. Yeah. And it's hard to think that a person can be that devious. Yeah. And we're just not, most of us just aren't trained to think that way, to think ill of people right away. And so, but then you also, you have that where they feel so wronged and that you've taken something away from them. So the feeling of, I want to take something back from you feels good. But the problem is that never fills that hole. Yeah. And so that's what I mean by saying the issue is never the issue, because you can say, all right, fine, you can have the kids more often or whatever else. And then there's a new issue.
Yeah. So what about the kids, Trish? Like if, you've gotten yourself out, you've gone through divorce, whatever, you're, living somewhat happily now, and the kids have to go back and forth. I know that, like, in the marriage, let's say in the relationship and even in the divorce, they are using them as pawns and trying to, use them as a means of controlling. Does that behavior transfer then from, once they've lost control of their partner, transfer on to the children? Or does that transfer elsewhere to maybe a new relationship or what have you? But how are the kids doing?
Yeah, not well, unfortunately. People oftentimes rely on the fact that, or they think is the fact that children are resilient. And yes, they are to a certain extent, but they also aren't, in the sense that you just have to look at us as adults, that, kids are so malleable and their brains are so malleable that's why it's so easy for them to learn languages so quickly, because their brains are just sponges, as we know. And they have to be, because that's when they're learning how to walk and talk and all these things. And so what people don't seem to realize is that even if they're not directly abused, which oftentimes they are, just the indirect effects of having mom or dad be abused affects them in such a way that where that parent can't be the parent they need them to be, or they actually see that behavior and may end up modeling it. And so they may end up later either in a similar relationship, or they may end up modeling that behavior. And it's so much more difficult to undo that damage as an adult. And there are so many of us walking around as adults that don't even know that we've been traumatized by things, but we know something's wrong. And then we have to spend years of trying to undo it. And so I'm glad that at least the Divorce Act Amendment has looked at the fact that it can be indirect effects of children as well, too, because it used to have to be, is that person directly abusing the child? But oftentimes that does happen. It's just a matter of if people think it's direct or not. Because if you're using your child as a pawn, that's direct abuse, 100%. I don't, if I was, if that happened to me as an adult, I'd feel abused and used. So a child, particularly when you're trying to prey on their affections and their biological need to have affinity towards both parents in order for them to survive. That's just a biological urge we have. We can't do anything about that. To prey on that, I think, is sick and is very, very much indicative of abuse.
So I would say crucial then, if you are experiencing this, if you're going through separation and divorce, there's children, to bring in a third party, to bring in a child expert, to get them, because presumably they're obviously trained in, looking out for all of these signs, because I'm guessing kids can't necessarily verbalize, right? If even as adults, we're able to sort of fall into this trap, if you will, as intelligent, fully formed humans. Now here are these little guys, maybe they can't verbalize it in such a way. So bringing in that child expert, I think, is crucial. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. Yes, because kids, human nature is so interesting. You think that kids would notice the abuse and be upset at that parent.
Yeah.
But in fact, what ends up happening, and it also can be too, not just overt abuse or coercive, it can also be neglect, which is just as traumatizing. And so what ends up happening though with children is that instead of blaming the adults, that's just not how we're wired. We tend to internalize it and we start to feel shame and what's wrong with me. And so that's how it manifests itself. And that is very difficult to undo as well. And then there also sometimes becomes a trauma coerced attachment. So because people think, and I've many times where you think, well, if they were really being abused, would they really want to spend time with that person? Yes, 100%. Oftentimes,
like
because they
kind
are
of syndrome. Where they like attached. Yeah, they're like attached to their abuser.
Or terrified.
Or terrified. Or all of the above. And then they feel very protective of one parent because they sort of fear them.
100%. Yeah. Wow. So in that case, it's very difficult. And I'm very much a big fan too of wanting to know the children's, voice. I want to hear the voice and the preference and that kind of thing. I like the concept of voice, not necessarily a choice, because the children are very much caught. And also even just in the loyalty bind, I know at my age as an adult, I always think of this. And I think if my parents currently were at odds and were trying to pull at me and making me side with one of them, I couldn't handle it. And I'm a grown woman.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we expect little children to do this, right? It's a very, very difficult thing for them to do in terms of, as they get older, sure. But to make them choose, I sometimes have difficulty with that because I can't imagine what that would be like, because you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're hurting somebody. And then who do you blame? Yourself? Yeah. And then to undo that again is really tough.
And I feel like regardless of abuse, there's still the love for both parents. As a child, you do have that innate love. And so, to go against it or to, really stand up for it is so difficult and so unfair. Oh,
and I can imagine, like, for the victim, knowing that maybe they got out of the direct line, right, of fire, but their kids are still in it. And the kids still have to go back and forth. And the kids, and they can't protect them too.
Yeah. How do you navigate that? So in terms of the court, so let's say you were successful in proving that there was coercive control, there was abuse. Okay, great. Off you go. But the kids still have time with both parents. Now you're riddled with the guilt, of course, of having, as Amanda said, escaping, but they still have to go. But so if we are incorporating voice of child, if we are getting these third party professionals and they can say, yes, the children as well are caught in this abuse cycle. Like, are the courts and the family law professionals protecting them from that? Are they then going to the victim only? No, you're shaking your head. Yeah, they
No.
have to go back and forth. Yeah.
I really would, what I'd love to see in a perfect world, and I don't see why we can't get to this at some point. We've proven with science that when there is coercive control and the other parent is being abused, inherently that means the child is being abused
Yeah.
or neglected or maltreated. So to me, there's no gray area with that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I find is that we then, just like with protective orders, we then put the onus on the victim to prove to us that it actually is in fact harming the child, or it will continue to harm the child, because we still, even though we don't have presumption of parental rights, we still act like there is, because everybody always assumes that the child is much better off with both parents, regardless of abuse. And I disagree with that. My theory is, and so a lot of scientific research shows this too, that there's no such thing as a good enough parenting. That if you're an abuser, there's this myth that if you're an abuser, you can still be a good enough parent. And I disagree. I think that you are modeling improper behavior, and there's no possible way, when they are fixated and obsessed on controlling the other parent, and you have a child who can be a vehicle to that, there's no way that child goes through it unscathed. And by continuing to allow them to have time without the expectation of the abuser stopping that behavior, I think is maltreatment. And I think we're complicit in that abuse. Also, that then forces the abuser and the victim to communicate, which then perpetuates more abuse for the victim.
Right.
And I just think that we're doing a very poor job of protecting the entire family and putting the onus on the victim to try and figure it out. You know, I've heard judges many times and lawyers say, I can't take this anymore. I can't deal with this anymore. And I always think, can you imagine what it's like for the victim then?
Right.
But we're always expecting them to do it.
Deals with it every single day of their life.
Yes. I think it should be where, if this is proven, so like what you said, the example, it's been proven there's coercive control, great. Instead of figuring out now what's a good parenting schedule, I think we need to focus on what is the abuser going to do then to change that behavior so that it is safe for the child to go.
Yeah.
Not to assume that it should be okay, or not to assume that, well, the other parent will protect them from, you can't protect them from someone else's behavior like that when they're by themselves with that other parent. And we don't do enough of that. That's where the accountability factor comes in. If it's proven, they should then have to prove to the courts or whomever that I've changed, I've done whatever it is that you have to do.
Love that.
And then now it's safe. Because if it's not safe, it's not good for the child. The benefit, the risks outweigh the benefits by far.
Yeah, we have to put the burden on the abuser to demonstrate for a period of time a success. It's just like, oh, you have to go to anger management and then you can have your job back, or you have to attend this harassment workshop and then you can, go back to integrating with the other. Like there needs to be
a process. On and the onus needs to be on the abuser, not on the victim.
Let's petition the courts for that. I like that plan. Yeah. That sounds good.
And also, speaking of the courts, you mentioned legal abuse, and I see that a lot post separation, where there's so much litigation. People drown the other side in litigation. That, from my understanding, can be a tactic by people who are, demonstrating coercive control.
Exactly. It's a very effective tactic because it's socially acceptable, because it's a person's right to have access to justice, to go through the court system or mediation or arbitration. I find oftentimes lately I've found too that they're very against mediation, and I find it interesting. But they because it's a great way to make the other party go broke. It's a great way for the other party to go absolutely bonkers, because you're constantly having to deal with constant affidavits and replies to the court. Also, it's a great way for them to be constantly in their life, constantly in the communication with them, and to get your digs in and to try and smear them. And, especially financial disclosure, I find, is a really big one. And that's where I think as professionals, we need to do a better job. And we talked earlier about red flags. Always, 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 always have I seen, there's never been a time where financial abuse hasn't occurred and then morphed into legal abuse. And what I mean by that is the first red flag is, no, I'm not giving you financial disclosure, which is a major tenement. It's a basic tenement of family law.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there's no gray area. Yeah. It is a law, and judges don't like it, and you need to do it. You have to do it. And so they do it, but, I've forgotten a couple of years, or you have to beg for it, or you don't have access to it. And this back and forth that we do with lawyers, it takes so much time. Meanwhile, the other party's not getting the support they need. And then what I hear is the clients are being told, you know what, You must be getting tired of paying my fees. Let's just take what they're offering, be done with it, get on with the divorce, and you can get on with your life, which is by far probably the worst thing I think you can say to anybody, but particularly a victim. And it drives me crazy when I hear that. I think that's such a huge sin. And we've got to stop doing that as professionals, because we're re-victimizing these people,
Right.
telling them that there's nothing we can do when you're paying this individual to try and do something about it. And so stop being unreasonable and just take what you can get.
And they sort of exhaust the victims through this legal abuse where
Right.
they're financially worn out, emotionally worn out. They just can't take it anymore. So they settle for something that they probably shouldn't, just to try and make it stop.
Awful. Speaking of the courts, is there a performative aspect to this? I'm thinking in terms of like, you know, if there's this sort of systematic, let's say gaslighting even, where, you know, as the victim, you literally think you're going insane. Did I imagine this stuff? What is happening? So they look cool, calm, and collected. Meanwhile, you're a hot mess of disaster. You're not remembering things in chronological order. You're just all over the place because you're a victim of abuse. Is there sort of a high that comes off of that? Again, this like, you know, challenge accepted, and I get to like show off how I've got all my shit together. Meanwhile, look at this person who's making all these accusations. Is that kind of what keeps the you know, hamster on the wheel as well?
I think so, very much so, because they almost seem to they have to enjoy it, because the time invested in this, there has to be some element of joy and
It's like a whole
thrill
job
and
for them.
and feed off of it, and it's sick, right? And that's what we have trouble as victims to think. Why would you want to do this? It doesn't even make sense
Get
to
a
me.
life.
You know, yeah, exactly, right? Like,
Move
I can't stand the
on. Get
chaos,
a
but they love
life.
it. Move on. And you know what's interesting about that too, just as an aside, even when they do move on to another relationship, I find that doesn't change a thing. You think it
No.
would. You think, okay, good, now they have a life.
Right. They're still
Nope,
fixing
because
on the initial person.
yeah, and that's what I mean. It doesn't matter how much they've been left whole. You could be decimated, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And it very much, they prey on the fact that these poor victims have already been destroyed. And then we have sometimes the lawyers, sometimes not understanding that and pressuring them, or the judges not understanding. Just like we do in sexual assault cases, we're punishing the victim. And if you don't remember it properly, or if you're not the perfect victim, you're not really a victim. So if you're calm, cool, and collected, which I find most victims tend to be, because they've taught themselves to behave in a certain way to survive with this abuser. And so in court, they often do that. And I've seen many times too, where, and I can understand it, but we have to be more educated about that. They look at this victim and think, how bad can it be? Because look at you.
Right.
You know, and I say that to my clients. I said, just be forewarned that this is what's going to happen. It's wrong, but we'll deal with it, in the sense that as you're talking to me now, if you're not educated, a person can fall victim to thinking, well, your actions don't coincide with what your words are saying. And they figure they should be a mess. But then if you're a mess, you're completely dysregulated, and really, can you be a good parent? Like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Right.
But there is that high where it's almost like they push, 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 push. They make you just go absolutely insane, and then they just kind of sit back and they watch the fruit of their labor. And that's where I feel that the opposing counsel needs to do a better job of making sure that their client isn't doing that. But the problem is with that is that right now, the way that their model code is that they don't have to do that.
Yeah.
Whatever the client wants, as long as it's within legal bounds, they don't have to do
They're
that.
the
And so
hired
there is a
gun
push
for them.
Exactly.
And they don't, and they do
exactly.
it, right? Because it pays the bills, and it's like, I mean, morally, obviously there's an issue there, but I feel like so many of these like intense, litigators will be that hired gun and will continue to facilitate the abuse.
Well, it's part of your job description. You are there to advocate for your client by all means necessary, right? So if
they
that
shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Well, I agree.
Right? Like, there should be some accountability for the lawyers. Forget about their clients. Okay, that's another issue. But there should be some accountability for the lawyers who are engaging in this, who are,
100%.
allowing this. They shouldn't be allowed to.
No, and so they've been theoretically trained in all of these styles of abuse and intimate partner violence of any sort. So they're looking out for it for their own client. But if their client isn't the victim,
and
then the gloves are off.
And they know, like, come on.
They know.
These are very highly educated, highly skilled lawyers. They know that what their client is doing, and they're still.
But they can turn a blind eye because legally.
They're still, because they're allowed to do it. And there needs to be some accountability there, I think.
Another petition.
Yeah.
There does too. But you know what? On the flip side of that too, is that these lawyers also, we don't have enough mechanisms for them to get that person to stop or to get that person to comply. And that's the thing. I heard lawyers say the other day that too, that if they're not complying with the financial disclosure, I can't compel them to unless you go to court. And that's the problem. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but you're right that there needs to be a moral, people need to have a bit of moral guideline, because we can't wait necessarily, I think, for their model, their code of conducts and whatnot to change, even though it's a push for that, especially in family law, but that's not going to happen. I doubt anything anytime soon. I just think if you're looking, where the confusion is for me is the whole premise of family law is best interest of the child, but that doesn't coincide with what lawyers are tasked to do. Like you're saying, advocate for your client. Sometimes those things do not coincide. Sometimes those things are at odds. So which one are we looking at? You know, and we're always pushing for best interest of the child. But if you know the behavior your client is engaging in is not in the best interest of the child, why are we not doing something about that?
Right. Yeah. I guess to play devil's advocate, then they'll say, well, if you don't send the letter, you don't do this, I'll go to someone else who will.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. They'll just shop. They'll shop around to find the sharky, someone who will do the dirty.
One with no morals.
Yeah. And those people do exist.
Yeah.
And so,
That's
what do you do? Maybe then it's up to a judge to say, this is legal abuse. This amount of litigation needs to stop. These letters, it needs to stop. Like, someone needs to step in.
Yeah, because it's different than vexatious litigation. I know people get those two confused, and I know that our previous here in Alberta, our Associate Chief Justice Rook was very, very, very against, and seemed to love to take the cases where we had vexatious litigation against. Not so much in family law, but elsewhere. But it's not that. It's I think the intention is different, and here it's just a vehicle. It's not. They don't necessarily want to go to court. It's just another beautiful, socially acceptable example or tactic they can use other than financial abuse, and it's so public, which they enjoy as well too. And so I just think it's too easy to engage in that legal abuse because we don't have enough mechanisms to stop it before it gets to court. And also we also don't have, like here in Alberta now, before you can make a court filing, you have to do 4 things, and one of them is ADR and do a course and 2 other things, and that is very difficult to do when there's domestic violence. And so we'll see how this all plays out. But we don't have, I think a lot of times people just give up before you can even get to court. And people do say where I struggle is if we don't do a better job here, at least I'm talking to Alberta about with our ADR, making sure that we have other mechanisms sometimes for domestic abuse, that I find a lot of victims are just acquiescing. Because it's not up to the mediators. Like, yes, you have to be educated and whatnot, but as well know how it works. It's not up to the mediators. You're not arbitrators. So it's really essentially up to the 2 parties. And yes, it can be very successful, but that's because the victim's acquiescing. And that's what happens is the lawyers also expect. So all parties are expecting them to acquiesce. So eventually they do. And so it looks like it's a success on paper, but it's not.
I've had my own, files where they are victims of sexual abuse or other types of domestic violence, and they still have to create a parenting plan. They have to let the child go. They have to communicate. And obviously I'm facilitating it with safeguards in place and trying to make sure that everybody's safe. But at the end of the day, they still have to comply. Right.
You just hit the nail on the head. Exactly. That at the end of the day, we're still relying on the fact that the notion that, well, they'll still be a good enough parent when, I question their decision-making ability. I question because if you are damaging and trying to destroy the other parent, I'm not sure how in any way, shape, or form that's okay for the children.
Yeah.
Right.
And to allow that, we're supporting abuse as well too. And so your hands are tied in that sense.
Right.
And that's my issue is that people think, okay, well, great, we have mediation. But we still have the end of the day, exactly, that the outcome still has to be the same, and nobody's changing that.
Yeah. Right. And children's aid isn't either.
No.
You call, even if a mediator, we have duties to report. Okay, so you make a report, you've called children's aid, mediation stops. The parents now aren't working on any type of resolution. Children's aid opens a file, closes a file, and it takes a lot for them to actually do anything. So then what? So then where do they go?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because this is a really sore point with me. In Alberta, I found a lot of my clients lately have been telling me they've gone to child services and they've been told, oh, sorry, if you're in the process of separation or divorce, we don't touch you. And I say, really, it's interesting because if you look at the law
Right.
states that they are mandated to investigate every
Right.
allegation. It doesn't matter what kind of family that comes from. And to me, that's discriminatory.
Totally.
But the problem is it's a funding issue. So they don't have enough funding. So they rely on the fact that if there's at least one parent willing and able to parent, we're hands off then. And I said, so even if there's all this stuff is going on, we need to protect the child. Yeah, even you need to go to the lawyers and the judge, but they're not equipped. So everyone's kind of saying, not my job,
Not
right?
my job, not my problem, right?
Yeah.
And from children's aid perspective, this is the time when they need to get involved almost the most, because we know from the stats, this is when victims are most at risk.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so frustrating because, we have all these hopes and dreams and ideas of how things could change and should change, and our hands are tied.
True, but I think that there is hope. I think the more I have hope because we're talking about it more and more.
Yeah.
And again, I keep referring to sexual assault because it's so similar. It runs parallel. That for years we didn't talk about it, and now look at recently, especially in hockey. And I think that is good. The more silent we are about things, the easier it is to hide. And I tell my clients that too. If it's abuse, use those words. And some people will say, I don't know, it makes people uncomfortable. It should. It should make them uncomfortable.
Right.
And if it doesn't, that concerns me. But we need to talk about it, not to normalize it, but to make it known so that we're all forced to do something about it. And we're not forced until it's shoved in our faces and we have no choice but to do something about it.
Of course people aren't coming forward. This is the most stigmatized, embarrassing thing to say, oh yeah, I fell victim to an abuser, to my own partner. Like,
exactly.
That's really hard to
admit. I was
admit.
Financially controlled, or I was sexually controlled, or I was
whatever.
Like that must be so hard for the victim to actually admit that. And then when they do, they're told, nope, that's an allegation. You have a hidden agenda.
Oh.
So it didn't really happen. You're just saying that because it's convenient because you're in, family law dispute. So how convenient that all of a sudden you're screaming abuse? Well, because it happened. And this is why we're here.
Because, I just wish people would start to think logically that women aren't dumb. We know very well how we're going to be received if we make any allegation whatsoever. I don't think there's a woman in this world, or very few of them, that want to take that risk just for the fun of it, or just to get back at them, because you do not come out of it unscathed regardless. No. It has to really be worth it. Your protection, your need for protection has to be worth it. And so to make false allegations, for people to think that that's more logical than for it to happen, I really have an issue with that. And they need to really rethink their thought process.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's the parent of your child. Like it might be, you're not just making a false allegation against someone who you'll never see again, which obviously has its own issues, but this is the parent of your child. And this is something that you have to, speak to and live with that allegation too.
And the courts, as we know, are public record. So
your kids can read it one day.
Kids can read it. Colleagues can read it, whomever.
It's just, it's not set up to protect.
No,
it's not set up to protect victims, but hopefully with this change, the last 3 years, with this change, with the inclusion of the coercive control part of the definition, hopefully we're making steps to change and to making things better for them.
Well, what I'd love to see too, and this is a lofty goal, but I would love to see much more transparency. Our Chief Justice, as Supreme Court Justice Richard Wagner, is big on transparency. I think we should transcend that all the way down to family law, where we look at judges' rulings, and we have, I'd love to see is what they do in the medical world, have them meet for educational purposes to look at, okay, why did you rule this way? Because as we know, the rulings are all across the board. And what was their rationale? How did the family fare? Because we never look back. We just think, okay, decision's done. We never look.
How did they fare afterwards?
How they fare afterwards. And then based on that, should we be revamping our behavior? Not to punish, but just to improve. And that's what we do in the medical field. Lots of fields do that. And I think that's imperative we do that, not just when there's a fatality, but when any decision is made. If we're really, truly worried about the best interest of the child, how do we know we are acting in the best interest of the child if we don't check back with them later on? And I know that's a funding issue, but really, I'm tired of that excuse too. We're smart individuals, creative people. I'm sure we can figure out a way to do that if it's important enough to us.
And that's why, again, funding issues. But wouldn't it be nice if there was a family professional on the file who could follow the family.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
again, in a perfect world, right?
Yeah.
Someone who actually can follow
Yes.
them from beginning to end and then some to keep people sort of on track and report back maybe.
Yeah.
And I know it's kind of like, oh, Big Brother's watching you, but maybe people need
Mhm.
that sense of like
Mhm.
accountability that, yeah, there's going to be a follow-up. This decision, this
I
order
agree.
that was given isn't set in stone. Let's see how you do.
I
would
agree.
love that.
Yeah.
I would
There's no
love that.
incentive I find with the abusers, if even with consequences, the threat of consequences is not always a guarantee. But if they have tried something, let's say even just the financial disclosure, and or they've lied and
Yeah.
they're not found, no finding of perjury, because we don't do that in family law.
Right.
Then they're given carte blanche essentially. They think, great, I can do whatever I want because there's no threat
There's
of
no
consequence,
accountability.
nothing you can do. Yeah, so off I
you,
go.
you didn't disclose. Okay, so now we have an order to make you disclose. So just disclose, but there's no, I mean,
No
and
penalty.
sometimes costs, but like doesn't happen that much. So it's just
Nope.
off they go.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
So
so
you
interesting.
alluded earlier on about the criminal court versus family court, and we don't want to take up too much more of your time. But is there anything that we should know in regards to that? I mean, who is filing a criminal charge? Like, where else are we seeing coercive control outside of the family?
Well, so I'll talk about that criminalization that's happening in a second, but I'm of the belief that right now it's probably not the best thing to do because we currently have laws already that we're not utilizing. We have harassment laws. We have stalking laws.
Yeah.
Even with coercion, like the basic tenet of contract law too is and torts is based on the fact that if you deceive, even in mediation, if you don't come in good faith, the contract may be null and void.
Yeah.
Right.
Like really contract involves, and the divorce agreement, separation agreement is essentially, it is a contract.
Absolutely.
And if you do not bargain in good faith, and if you have lied and whatnot, it really, it nullifies it. And so we already have all these laws, but I was talking to a legal scholar the other day, why are we not utilizing those laws? And she said, yeah, I don't know. And so now there's this push, and I understand why we're doing it. The UK has done it. Scotland's done it, criminalizing coercive control as a means to protect victims. However, the problem that a lot of us have is that I think it's cart before the horse. People have not mastered coercive control in family law yet, but now we're going to do it criminally. And what we found in the UK, at least, is that we've had unintended consequences whereby more women have been charged because of allegations, let's say, of, how we see in family law, parental alienation and things like that. And somehow that's easier to believe. And then they become the alleged offenders when they're really not. And so, but we also have police who are still struggling with the intimate partner violence. But now we're going to criminalize coercive control, which is really hard to prove. I don't think it's going to be utilized. Yeah. And if it is, it might be overutilized by the abusers because we've seen how crafty they are. Like, for instance, it just came out, I think it was today, that now abusers are using e-transfers as a method to send abusive messages. So even if there is an order where they can't contact them, if they have to send money for whatever reason, they send an abusive message with it. They'll just send a payment for a penny and send an abusive message. So they're so crafty that we can't, like, victims aren't that crafty at that kind of evil. And so that's what we're concerned about too, is that it'll be used nefariously and by abusers.
That is so interesting. I hadn't heard that.
Isn't it?
Jeepers.
Yeah. Wow.
They know no bounds. Next time it'll be something else.
Wow.
I know. And with all the technology, right? I mean, who knows what else is coming down the pipeline in terms of means of communication. Ooh, that is
so much to think about.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, I know we are constantly looking out for it, but they're very sneaky. They're very crafty, as you said. And it's often hard to spot. And if professionals in this field are not doing, enough screening and enough learning about even what to look for, it can be so dangerous. So, I mean, thank you. This was beyond informative. We're really, really appreciative of your time and the work that you're doing. It's
well, my pleasure.
Really
Thank
incredible.
You.
And how do people get in touch with you if they want to bring you on as, an expert maybe in their family law proceeding or in other ways? How do they get in touch with you?
They can email me, but typically the best way is just through my website, trishguise.com. And you can contact me. My phone number is there. My email address is there. You can directly book from my website for any different services.
Good.
So it's Trish Guise, TRISHGUISE.com.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you
this
so
has been
much.
such a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This episode was written and created by Alex Howard and Amanda Silver, produced, edited, and engineered by RTF Productions. Make sure to rate and review our show if you loved it, and give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you stream your podcast to stay up to date on all upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and go easy on us. We're not your ex.
So here at Dirty Laundry, we have had the pleasure of working with Michael Korstein of Korstein Law.
Some of you might recognize him from our Ask Mike segments on our Instagram and from his appearances on Global News.
In addition to being the DL's trusted in-house counsel, Mike is a former Crown attorney who specializes in both criminal and family law.
Mike is a skilled litigator with extensive trial experience. His Toronto-based law firm, Korstein Law, offers both criminal and family law services.
So head on over to korsteinlaw.ca to book your consultation today.